If you got your Bibles, you can go ahead and open up to John chapter 2. If you don't have a Bible along with you today, it's going to be up on the screen in just a moment. I'm just going to start out this morning simply by reading the story that I want us to explore a bit together. John chapter 2, this is the second week in a series that we're making our way through some select parts of the Gospel of John. Last week we looked a little bit at chapter 1. Today I want to read a little story out of John chapter 2, starting in verse 1. John chapter 2, verse 1. On the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. And Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to this wedding. And when the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." "Woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied, "My hour has not yet come." But his mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. And Jesus said to the servants, "You go fill those jars with water." And so they went on and filled them to the brim. And then he told the servants, "Now draw some out and go on and take it to the master of the banquet." They did so. And the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. And then he called the bridegroom aside and he said, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, the best wine first, and then they bring out the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you've saved the best until now." Verse 11, what Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. That's John chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. Whenever I finish reading that story about this little wedding in the town of Cana, whenever I finish it, I kind of go through the same thing that I'm sure you go through, and that's that I can't stop thinking about what Jesus did. Right, this happens anytime you read something that's pretty miraculous, where there's been some kind of act of power that doesn't just bend kind of the natural laws of the world, but shatters them. Something supernatural has happened. And when I get done reading the story, I can't stop thinking about this amazing thing that Jesus did. I mean, he turned water into wine, 120, 150 gallons of wine like that at this little wedding in Cana. It's pretty amazing. But even above and beyond my not being able to stop thinking about what Jesus did, what I find myself thinking about more and more, especially after spending more and more time with this story through the years, is really I can't stop thinking about what this tells me about who Jesus is. It's not so much always me thinking about what he did and how amazing that it is, but what this tells me about who he is, because that's even more amazing to me. What I mean by that is I can't stop thinking about what this moment where Jesus turns water into wine, what it tells me about his nature. What it tells me about how when he looks at me, what he's driven to do, how he looks to carry himself at all times. When he looks at me, when he looks at you, his nature, how he chooses to minister among us. That's what I find myself just stunned, silent, if not stunned into worship, what this tells me about who Jesus is. Now, my wanting to think on that more, about who Jesus is, more than what Jesus did, is exactly what John wants me to do. It's exactly what John wants you to do. I mean, one of the things I think is really huge in the Gospel of John is it's very easy, and I've already used the language of miraculous and miracle. It's very easy to just refer to this as a miracle, and it is a miracle, the turning of water into wine. It does break these natural laws that we know to be true. It's an act of power. It's a miracle. But did you notice when I was reading this that in verse 11, John is very careful to say, I want you to see this as a sign. That's a little bit different than just seeing this as a miracle. By all means, view this as a miracle. But John says, I want you to see this as a sign, because a sign points to some reality beyond itself, doesn't it? I mean, that's the way a road sign works. The road sign isn't the actual place you're wanting to get to. It's pointing you forward to what you're really looking for. John's saying, I don't want you to be so enraptured by what he did that you miss out on what is said about him by what he did. That's what I want you to not be able to stop thinking about, what this tells you about the nature of Jesus. And I find myself thinking about what this tells me about Jesus. And this is what this miracle, this sign tells me about Jesus. It's that he is so lavish. I put the title there in the little bulletin insert that you have, he lavishes. That when you look at Jesus, that's a word that we don't use a whole lot anymore. Do you know what I mean by lavish? It means, this is putting it a little crudely, but he's crazy generous. That like Jesus outdoes himself when he gives things to us. That he goes above and beyond what is called for. He just, like if this is a line like, hey, at least give this much, Jesus just steps right over it. He's crazy generous. Lavish. He's lavish. Jesus is someone who is wrapped up in lavishness. He lavishes things upon us. That's what I find myself thinking about. And in particular, I find myself just standing in awe of the thing that he lavishes upon us, the thing that he doles out on us. And that's what I want to point out to you today, I think in a word that I hope is really very appropriate for us on the first post-Easter Sunday that we have together. Up on the screen, it'll pop up there again in verse 3. There's this moment where Mary comes up to Jesus there at this wedding in Cana, right? And she comes up. And in that little verse, in verse 3, it looks like she just makes this little observation to Jesus. She comes to him and says, hey, they have no more wine. And it's very easy to read it in the translation that is just that, like this declaration, this proclamation, a little observation from Jesus' mom. She comes along and says, hey, I don't know if you've noticed, but they've run out of wine. But really, you and I know that this isn't just a proclamation. This isn't just an observation. What Mary is doing here is what? She's nudging him, isn't she? Like, Jesus, I don't know if you've noticed this or not, but they've run out of wine. Kind of a big deal at a wedding celebration. This could get really awkward for the family, for the bride and the groom. I don't know if you noticed, but they've run out of wine. She's nudging him, right? She's not just pointing it out to him. She's nudging him. Basically what she's saying is, I wonder if maybe you can do a little something here. She nudges him because she knows, doesn't she? She knows him. And what she knows to be true about Jesus is Jesus has got amazing powers. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that up to this point he's done anything. Again, you've heard all of these little rumors about extra gospel accounts about Jesus doing all kinds of amazing things when he was a little kid. I don't buy into all of that because John's very clear this is the first sign, this first moment of this miraculous activity of Jesus. But she does know he has the power to do something about this. She has known this since the day the angel came and visited her and told her that she was going to be pregnant with the one who had been long promised by the prophets to come and redeem Israel. And Mary, being a Jewish woman and then being betrothed to a Jewish man, Joseph, knows very well the promise. We talked about this a little bit last week with Nathanael. All the Jews were raised in anticipation of a moment where the Lord was going to be born into their world and he was going to rise up and he would hold within him great power. And what this great power is, at its core, is resurrecting power. The power to be able to breathe new life into things that are dead. This is the promise that has always been declared by the prophets. But the images that you read in the Old Testament about a valley that's filled with these dry, dead bones, and yet God can breathe life into them. About this idea that this land it's parched, if not scorched by the fire of war, and yet I will rise up life. It's just life, life, life. There will be resurrecting power in this Lord when he comes and dwells among you. Mary knows that Jesus holds within them that kind of resurrecting power. She nudges him because she knows. She knows and she believes, listen, this is important, that surely Jesus isn't just going to use his resurrecting power to raise people from the dead, but to bring life into any situation that shows signs of death or dying. That Mary knows and believes all around the world there is so much death and so much dying. And even all the way to what might seem really small to us, The death and the dying of a wedding celebration of such joy in the eyes of God, and that if they run out of wine and people find out about it, some people will be offended or hurt, and it could bring shame on this family's name. And so she nudges Jesus to say, can you maybe use just a little bit of that resurrecting power to just inject a little bit of life back into this? Because she believes, surely you're not just going to use this to raise us from the dead, but to speak of any death and any dying in this world. We know that Mary believes this because of the song that she sings after she's told by the angel that she's going to be giving birth to the Son of God. Have you ever read Mary's song in Luke chapter 1? It's not just Mary singing a song about how blessed am I to carry in my womb the one who's going to be the Savior of this world who will rise us up from the dead, but rather she goes on and says, man, when he steps in this world, he is raising the estate of the people who are steeped in poverty. That is going to lay low the crushing systems. It's a really very politically subversive song that she sings. It's the power of this woman. And she sings a song which said, Jesus will stand among us and he's going to breathe life into the dead, dying social structures that have crushed us. Because this child in my womb, if he's a Savior, if he's a Messiah, he has resurrecting power that speaks to everything that is dead or dying. Hey, Jesus, I don't know if you've noticed this, but they're running out of wine. Actually, I think they've run out altogether. You can do a little something about this. And then you have Jesus' reply in verse 4. I think it's the most important verse in this whole passage. It's also the one that makes us the most uncomfortable because it makes it sound, well, it sounds really very cold, but I think it leads us to something absolutely beautiful. It's up on the screen in verse 4. Remember Jesus' reply. It says, woman, why do you involve me? My hour has not yet come. Now, to get to where I want to get, I probably need to address something that we just need to kind of get past this whole idea that, dude, Jesus called his mom woman. It's a little uncomfortable to us, isn't it? I would never call, I just turned 37. I would never call my mom woman, okay? Because I like having my head on my shoulders. I would never encourage Eden to refer to, woman, what are you doing? What we need to just get past, and I hope you realize, we're dealing with a different culture here, okay? And so if you kind of rummage around the history of this was a pretty common way for men and women to interact with one another, even sons with their mothers, okay? So just kind of get past it. Jesus isn't being a jerk here. He's just addressing her in the common language of that time. What I find to be powerful is Jesus says this thing that sounds so cold at first. Woman, why are you involving me in this? Why are you involving me in this? The original Greek, in fact, they always dress it up sometimes. Really, the Greek, it's a little bit more crass than that. Jesus says, woman, what's this to me? Hey, they've run out of wine. What is this to me? What does this have to do with me? So they're running out of wine. It's pretty small potato stuff, Mom. Jesus, maybe you could breathe a little life into this situation because you know what this is going to mean for the family and the joy and the celebration. What does this have to do with me? You know what, Mom? I think there's probably some bigger situations concerning death and dying than just this. If a wedding celebration kind of dies out because they run out of wine, what's the big deal? It's probably happened before. And I know Jesus is kind of wondering about this out loud because of what he says right after that. Woman, why do you involve me? What does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. You read the Gospel of John, the rest of the Gospel of John, whenever Jesus refers to the hour, you know what he's talking about? He's talking about his death, burial, and most important, his resurrection. My hour for me to be able to defeat the thing that I came to defeat, which is sin and death and dying. The fact that when we die, that we are separated by God because of this rebellion in our lives. I've come to take care of that, and that hour hasn't come yet. Like, I know what you're doing, Mom. You're nudging me to bring some resurrecting power into the situation. Don't you think maybe in the grand scheme of things, this is pretty small potato stuff? What does this have to do with me? Jesus is wondering aloud. I would argue that I think he is playfully wondering aloud. I don't think he's trying to sound like a jerk. Hey, well, that's their problem. It's not mine. I think what he's playfully trying to do for anyone who's kind of listening on the beauty of this conversation is he's wondering, do y'all think maybe it might be a little lavish if I use my power to deal with something like this? Maybe that's a little over the top. Maybe that's something unexpected. Look, what he's trying to do is to stir him the wonder, well, is he going to do something? Is this small potato stuff? Did he just come to breathe resurrection into just this one thing that's a major thing? He's making them wonder about that because what happens is Jesus realizes, remember, this is not just a miracle, this is a sign, John says. Because Jesus knows, you know what, if I get them thinking in this direction, that surely he's not going to use his power just to do something that seems so small on the grand scheme of things, that I know that if in this moment I move miraculously, it will be as clear as can be that I did not come just to use my resurrecting power to breathe life into dead bodies so that we can live forever in heaven, but that it might actually be able to do something now. That there can actually be life in something that is dead and dying now. So he's playfully thinking this out loud. Jesus isn't being a jerk. What he's trying to do is, I'm about to show you something beautiful about me. It's not yet my hour, but I think I'm going to do some things ahead of schedule. Because what happens on the other side of him playfully wondering this aloud, and it's funny because Mary even just goes ahead, doesn't she? She's pretty bold in this text, doesn't she? Woman, why do you involve me in this? It's not yet my hour. And then it says she turned this to her and said, do whatever he tells you to do. Because I think she knows his nature, which is to be lavish. And he does it. I mean, you want to talk about lavish in the quantity of wine, 120 and 150 gallons of wine. It's pretty clear the wedding celebration is winding down, but Jesus is like, here's 150 more gallons of wine. Not just in quantity, but he's lavish in quality, isn't he? I mean, the master of the banquet clearly says, man, this is actually like the best wine. This is pretty lavish. I mean, without a doubt, anyone who's there, and Jesus is kind of playfully wondering, is maybe this too lavish? Well, then he does, and they say, my goodness, this guy's pretty lavish. Pretty lavish with what? Man, don't think about wine. He's lavish with resurrection. All the way to the corners of something that seems so small, like, man, it kind of sinks that this celebration might die out, and it might bring shame into this family's name. And Jesus says, I'll step in to breathe life even into that. My hour's not come for that. It's come for this. I mean, this is a beautiful reality, Reunion. Now, this might sound really weird at first because the resurrection, the fact that when you die, that if you're found in Jesus, that you will live forever, that you will be resurrected, that you will live again like Jesus did, don't get me wrong, amazing. But isn't it amazing as well to know this is the nature of Jesus, that him raising from you the dead at some point then, invoking his resurrecting power in your life then when you die, is actually in his mind not lavish enough. Like he wants to do things for you now. He wants to invoke the resurrecting power now, that he does invoke the resurrecting power now, even in the smallest of things that seem so tiny and minuscule in the grand scheme of things. Isn't that amazing? He loves you this much that physical bodily resurrection in his mind isn't enough. He wants to do more. In fact, that's what's so frustrating sometimes when it comes to Easter is like, today we must talk about the resurrection. Every day is a discussion of the resurrection. We are drowning in resurrection. In the Gospel of John, do you know how much resurrection happens before the resurrection? I mean, so many scholars point out in the Gospel of John that it's divided up. The way the story moves forward is 7 signs. You got the turn of the water into the wine. You got the healing of the royal official's son. You got the healing of the man who's paralyzed. You got the walking on water, the feeding of the 5,000, the healing of the man born blind. You got the raising of Lazarus from the dead. Sign, 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 sign. All of them are resurrections. All of them is Jesus calling forward resurrecting moments in each of these tiny little things. In the midst of thousands of lives, he's at work bringing life out of things that seem dead. And this is before the resurrection. Resurrection before the resurrection. Everywhere he's invoking his resurrecting power. And it's not just all fireworks and everything. This is the kind of thing that we need to understand. That all throughout the Gospel of John, or Matthew, Mark, and Luke, whatever gospel you want to read, there's resurrection just simply through the power of his words and people embracing them. And this is what's so beautiful in the Gospel of John, where there's a moment where Peter says to Jesus, when there might be a temptation for him to turn away from Jesus, he says, I don't know where else I'm going to go. Why? Because you alone hold the words of life. Words of life. Just by Jesus speaking and teaching, there's resurrection. On the other side of his teaching, marriages are being saved, shame is being chased away, anger is being confronted, some of the religious leaders are being dismantled. It's resurrection everywhere. You're drowning in resurrection even before the resurrection and even after the resurrection. Because the climax of John's gospel is actually not Jesus walking out of the tomb. What is it? It's the resurrecting of Peter of sorts, isn't it? When Jesus pulls Peter and them around the fire, I read this last week to you in our Easter service when Jesus says, Peter, you are forgiven. And it's life. He lavishes resurrecting power on us, doesn't he? When I read this little story about the wedding in Cana, I can't stop thinking about what we just did, but even more than that, I can't stop thinking about what this tells me about who Jesus is, what this tells me about the nature of his ministry then and now, that he lavishes resurrecting power upon us. Breathing life into things that long seem dead and things that seem like they've been dying for years. Can't stop thinking about him. But, and this is where we get into application. Here's the other person that I can't stop thinking about when I read this little story about the wedding in Cana. Because it's not just Jesus. Jesus is who I should be thinking about more than anything else. But when I read this little story in John chapter 2 about the wedding in Cana, there's someone else I can't stop thinking about. Actually, there's two people I can't stop thinking about. You know who it is? It's the master of the banquet and it's the groom. I don't know if, because what I can't stop thinking about is their nature. What this tells me about them. And I kind of hate it because I don't like what it says about me at times. I don't know if you noticed this when I read the story in John chapter 2, but when it comes to the master of the banquet and it comes to the groom, do you realize those dudes are completely oblivious? Did you catch that? Completely oblivious. John even points it out. The master of the banquet tastes the wine and says, this is pretty good. And it says, and he had no idea how it showed up. Completely oblivious. And then he takes her to the groom and he says, man, you brought out the best wine. The groom's sitting there going, I have no idea what this guy's talking about. And he doesn't care. This is completely oblivious. In fact, that's what stands out to me. It's not just that they're completely oblivious. They are completely comfortable in being completely oblivious. They don't ask any questions. If something like this happened and you were the master of the banquet, don't you think you'd ask like, hey, I knew we were running low. I'm not really sure how we got 150 gallons more. But he doesn't ask, does he? They go to the groom. Hey, taste the wine. You save the best. You know what? The groom's just like any other groom. He's trying to figure out, how do I save some money? Do you think he's sitting back and he's saying, well, that's a little strange. I don't know how the best wine's coming out because really the system was for that to maybe not be the case. If I get them a little drunk, they're not going to know they're basically drinking water. Dude's oblivious, doesn't even ask any questions. Completely comfortable being completely oblivious. They just drink deep the lavishness of this resurrection, don't they? Just drink it deep. Don't really care the source. Don't really care about stopping and maybe just doing a little bit of personal reflection. These guys are startling to me. I can't stop thinking about them. And I can't stop thinking about them because their inability to be conscious to the lavishness of Jesus in resurrection, it costs them something dearly. I'll come back to that in just a moment. It costs them something dearly. I just want to take a moment to talk about us, because something about this right now should start to make us feel a little uncomfortable. Because the truth is, if you're anything like me, and you can deny it, but you're lying. If you're anything like me, man, there are so many times you just blissfully float through life completely oblivious to the resurrection around you. Don't you? The reason I'm bringing this up is because this is one of those things that happens. We will gather together on Easter Sunday, and we will sing with passion. We will whisper prayers. Maybe we will shout prayers. We will laugh. There will be tears of joy in our eyes because the tomb is empty, because this man died and he defeated that death. Like I come together in joy, and I realize this means one day all of us, even when we pass from this world, will be reunited in life, resurrection, that he can breathe new life into dead bodies. Dead men and women can go walking. It's stunningly beautiful, and we're so excited. I'm like, for me, it speaks deeply to me because of the loss of my dad. Many of you here have experienced great loss, and what we're always thinking about is death and resurrection, the most literal physical form of death and resurrection in that sense. And yet every single day there is Easter around us. There's resurrection everywhere, because what this tells us, the sign of this, is that he is lavish with this power. He doesn't just invoke it for you when he dies or you die. He invokes this for you now, and maybe even the thing you think is so small you're scared to ask him to breathe new life into it. Lavishes. Here's a really important question that you need to ask yourself today. And it's a really important question I need to ask myself. I'm not dismissing myself. This is a really important question you need to ask yourself tomorrow. And I would maybe encourage you to ask it the day after that. I would encourage you to ask this question at the close of every single day of your life. Ask it alone, ask it with a spouse, ask it with a friend, ask it with your house church. And the question is this: hold on just a minute. Where today did I see resurrection? Like, where today was there death? And I'm not talking just physical death, though maybe some of you are wrestling through that. I'm talking about, where was there any kind of death? Death of joy, death of certainty, death of all kinds. Where was there death? Where was there a dying? Where was there depression? Where was there anxiety? Where was there worry? Where was there death today? And then suddenly, life. Because listen, reunion, all resurrection is God's resurrection. All life is God's life. Where was there suddenly life today? Where one moment the wine is dry and the next you realize, I'm drowning in it. Life. Because it's not just the moments at funerals that we call on the beauty of this resurrection. It's the moment maybe where some of you have found yourselves in a marriage that seems like it is crumbling. And then suddenly life, this spouse who's been so stubborn for so long says, you know what, I realize I've kept my job first, money first, the kids first, this first, and I'm sorry, I don't know how to fix it, but I want to fix it. I want this to make it, because that's resurrection. There's a resurrecting power of Jesus. He lavishes. That's Jesus. Or in the moment where you're living in the pain and the oppression of this fractured family relationship, and yet then suddenly life, there's this phone call that's completely unexpected, and it's someone who's actually asking for forgiveness, life-giving forgiveness about something that had long been swept under the rug for them, but for you had been an open sore in your soul. That is Jesus. He lavishes. That you're steeped in some profound sadness, and yet you suddenly experience life because of some word of encouragement from someone you've not heard from for years, and it speaks like water to a soul that you had no idea it was that parched. That's Jesus. He lavishes. That moment where you have just been plagued by some, sin. Something that you have been carrying on day after day, and you feel like it has completely swallowed you up and there's no way you can break loose from it. And then suddenly one day, there's no other way to explain it, but it's resurrection, it's new life. You wake up and you realize this is vile, this is terrible, and I'm done. And you're actually done. This is Jesus. He lavishes resurrecting power. He does not just invoke this when we die. He invokes this wherever there is death, working with us to bring new life. And for some of you, I am sitting with you in pain in this because I know that some of you have gone through things in your life like I've gone through, like my wife has gone through with the death of her brother, with you're sitting back and you're saying, lavishness? What's all this talk about lavishness concerning resurrecting power? Where was this lavishness when you fill in the blank? And there's a lot of times where I've had to sit back with some of you as a minister, and I've had to tell you, I don't know. And yet one of the things I've had to come to in my own understanding, and I've said this many times, that it's painful for me to say this because I feel like this is one of those things, those trite things preachers can kind of push out there, and someone could say, you have no emotion involved in that. I really do. In this reality where I have had to understand within this world that we live that is so fractured, that the absence of one particular form of lavishness that I have craved does not negate the fact that there is still lavishness. Or that the absence of the one act of resurrection that I wanted so desperately because it never became a reality does not negate the fact that there was resurrection all around me. Some will beg before God for new life to be breathed into a dying marriage, and that new life does not happen for one reason or another. And yet if we are conscious of it, we begin to realize the new life that happens in a church body that surrounds us and lifts us up. Or sometimes, yes, it is the resurrection, the new life that comes through a marriage that just speaks life into our soul. Some of us have stepped back and we've realized this isn't just deep sadness I have, it's a depression. It's something that honestly, I don't know if I'm ever going to get over it. I'm going to be battling it for the rest of my life. And yeah, you know what? There's resurrection power that comes in the beauty and the grace and the new mercy of medicine. That sometimes we'll realize, this sin is going to follow me, or I'm going to walk my whole life with a limp, and this is always going to be a battle because it's an addiction, and yet what happens is you realize new life because God surrounds you maybe with accountability, with the right man or the right woman to speak encouragement, and sometimes pointed encouragement when you need it. That is Jesus. That is him lavishing. He lavishes resurrecting power, even if it doesn't match the exact lavishness we desire. It's incredibly good if we're conscious of it. I find myself that I can't stop thinking about these two guys, the master of the banquet and the groom, who are just completely oblivious and comfortable being completely oblivious. They're not asking any questions like, where did this new life come from? And I said to you a moment ago, it cost them something dearly. And you see what it cost them in the very last verse of our passage in verse 11. Because at the very end of this passage, John points out, master of the banquet didn't know and he didn't care. Bridegroom didn't know, he didn't care. What does it say at the end of verse 11? But his disciples saw. They took it in, his glory, the realization of his nature. What does it say? And they believed. They believed. You and I have known many people You and I have maybe been people who have felt over time a slow death of belief and of faith in Jesus. And I've had people come up to me and say, I don't understand how that guy, that gal who were so on fire for the Lord, how now where they're at, where they don't even believe in him. And I don't always have answers as to why that happens. There's probably a whole host of reasons for it. But I can tell you at least one reason coming out of this text is if there's something that can slowly kill off your faith and your belief in the power of Jesus and what he can do, it is in that kind of unconsciousness that you see in that bridegroom and in that master of the banquet. Because when my faith feels like it's dead or it's dying, it is because I have had a number of days in a row where I was not conscious of the fact that I was drowning in resurrection. But in those moments, I stop like the disciples and I behold it. How he lavishes, how I'm drowning in wine. I believe. I believe. I'm going to call the band up and we can do, we're going to do a couple songs here to close out our morning. I'm going to say a prayer and then I'll come up and I want to go through again very quickly a challenge for you this week before we close with one more song then after that. Well, questions that I want to have you think about this week with me. I told you this is an incredibly important question for us to ask. And I want to invite you to do this on your own, do this with a friend, with a spouse. Maybe your house church wants to think through this, to hear stories of resurrection. Where have you seen the resurrecting power of Jesus? The last few days, the last couple weeks, months, the last year? And take some time to be able to give thanks for that. To allow that to be able to stir in you belief. Allow yourself to be conscious of life. But I want to say this too, because this is important. Where do you still need that resurrecting power? To take a moment to be able to think about where do you sense there to be death of any kind, dying of any kind in your life, in the life of some loved one. And I want to invite you to ask Jesus to be lavish in that circumstance. Now listen, I'm not a guy who wants to overpromise, and I try my best never to overpromise because I think great damage can be done that way. You might call on God to be lavish in a situation. Might be different than what you were expecting. But that comes back to the other question, where did you see it still? But if there's something also we see in this text, it's not just becoming conscious of it and giving thanks for it and letting it stir belief, but ask for it. Because again, this is a sign, it's his nature. He longs to be lavish, okay? Take some time to do that this week.